Morning, everyone. Hope you're all well and happy. Okay, then. This is Tuesday's lesson for politics. What we're basically going to look at today is the core executive and the cabinet in particular. The plan is that on Thursday, so Friday, we'll then do the factors prime ministers have when they appoint cabinet, why ministers resign, and then next week we'll look at cabinet prime minister relations. And then if you look at the other thing then we need to do on the executive, according to the exam specification, that you need to know in some detail of at least, I can't remember if it's two or it's three prime ministers. Normally I do John Major, we've got to do Tony Blair. And then I don't know what to do the latest prime minister or what, but I think I did David Cameron last time. So look at Cameron, Theresa May, and see what they've been up to, and have a quick look at Boris Johnson as well. Okay then, so what I'm going to do today is quickly go over the homework or the work I set last time, which were about the resources available to a Prime Minister. No one's got back to me. Hopefully it's fairly straightforward. I'll then explain a little bit what the cabinet is and what some of its main functions are. There's then a bit of reading from the textbook that you need to do. I'll explain a little bit about something called the core executive as well. And again, there's a bit of reading on there. I've got a few little additional tasks as well. There's like that video, The Secret World of Whitehall. There's a nice episode on there, for example. I haven't got any questions on it. It's additional, but again, it will help you understand the executive. Right, so to begin with then, so last time, if I remember correctly, it seems like a long time ago now, I think I'd left you to do that work on the main resources available to provide a prime ministerial power, and you had patronage, authority in the cabinet system, policy making. I do hope they kind of make sense. To quickly go over them, just to make doubly sure, and if obviously you're happy with this and you know it all, you can fast forward me for a couple of minutes. Patronage, this is the Prime Minister has the power to appoint people to things. They can appoint members of Parliament to become cabinet ministers or junior ministers. They also have patronage in, they're very much involved in national awards as well, things like OBE and CBE, and giving people knighthoods. Obviously, it's the Queen who officially does that, but again, it's one of those prerogative powers which the Prime Minister actually is very much involved in that. Sometimes you see very loyal backbenchers will be knighted and made a Sir. And again, if you want to have a quick look, so you can find an example of that. And lots of other positions as well have that. So obviously Keir Starmer, the current Labour leader, before he entered politics, he was in charge of the Crime Prosecution Service, and he was knighted for that. And then he entered Parliament, and etc., etc. So it gives the Prime Minister a lot of power. And in one of those videos, Tony Benn, who's now dead, but he was saying about how patronage greases the wheels of stuff. If you've got a backbench MP who is not going to support the government on something, being a bit awkward, the whips can let it be known that the Prime Minister was going to give him a job in the government at some point. And, if he votes against them, he might blow his or her chances. So it does give the Prime Minister that power to kind of help influence and allow backbenchers in particular to go certain ways. Again, there are limitations to this as well. If they appoint too many of their close friends, say the Prime Minister, all his close friends will become knights or whatever, that can also backfire, looks bad in the media. There were these questions as well, wasn't there, under Tony Blair, when he appointed some members who had been very much involved in raising money for the Labour Party. They entered the House of Lords, again through the Prime Minister's patronage, which again caused some controversy. David Cameron's done much the same as well. Most of the people who helped him in the 2015 general election campaign, like campaign coordinators and stuff, they're all now in the House of Lords, and it did create a bit of a hoo-ha when that took place. Authority in the cabinet system. So we're going to do about the cabinet today, but the cabinet is basically those top ministers, and the Prime Minister, one of their official jobs is to chair those cabinet meetings. They decide the agenda, they decide who can speak and when. They all sit in order of precedence at the cabinet meetings. That gives the Prime Minister quite a lot of power, because if there's a topic which he doesn't want the Cabinet to perhaps discuss in great detail, he can kind of decide we're going to discuss it quite in short thrift, so to speak. If he knows a Cabinet member is against something or a bit awkward about something, he can just ignore him basically, or her, and not let that person speak, or let them speak for a very short period of time. Again, this can backfire as well. So Mrs. Thatcher, for example, there was a cabinet member called Nigel Heseltine in 1986. He was Defence Secretary. Was he Defence? Was he Trade? It's either Trade or Defence. He's had both positions at some point. I think it was Trade, actually. Anyhow, he was upset about purchasing some helicopters from a company called Westland. Mrs. Thatcher wanted this American company to buy these helicopters. Heseltine preferred Westland helicopters from Devon or Cornwall or somewhere to build these helicopters. He went to Cabinet and wanted to speak on this. Mrs. Thatcher, he said, didn't let him. In the end, he just stormed out of Cabinet, basically, and resigned on the spot. So Prime Minister's got to be careful about dealing with Cabinet. So they do have authority in the Cabinet, although if the Cabinet is divided, if the Cabinet is against them, if the Cabinet are a bit fractious, then they've got to be careful how they manage them. If they're too kind of, bashing them over their heads and ignoring them, then they can get their own back. And again, look at the downfall of Mrs. Thatcher for that. Okay, policy making input. So this is the ability of a Prime Minister to set the agenda. So some Prime Ministers, when they're in opposition, before they become Prime Minister, have a certain agenda which they've kind of gained support. They've won an election and then they want to push that agenda through. Some Prime Ministers develop an agenda once they're in office as time goes on. So you could say, for example, that Tony Blair and New Labour, to a large extent, had a fairly modest agenda. This idea about modernising Britain and all this kind of stuff, and devolution and all that business. And again, the Prime Minister often is involved in driving that through. He might find some cabinet members are less enthusiastic about it. He might find some of the civil servants less enthusiastic about it. He's got to try and persuade Parliament to vote for the legislation which he wants to introduce. So it's okay having a set of policies, but you've got to sell them to the people so you get elected, and then you've got to sell it and push it through government, push the laws through, make sure the civil servants know what they're doing. And again, that can take time, and you have to meet resistance because people don't like change, do they? Okay, so trying to change education system or something, that can be a real tough old job, because teachers might not like the changes. You might get the unions might be against it. The civil servants might be a bit unsure about aspects of it. So it's a lot of energy Prime Ministers take in trying to drive policies through, but having that a clear drive on that can give direction to the government. So everyone associates Mrs. Thatcher with her ideas of Thatcherism, don't they? Okay, Tony Blair to some extent with his ideas. You could say the agenda of Brexit. I suppose Theresa May tried to push that through, and Lee said on that. Boris Johnson, a very clear agenda, didn't he, when he came in? Won that general election in 2019 with that very clear agenda, we're leaving the EU. So he had a very clear policy direction. But of course now it's been blown off, hasn't it, by the crisis. So policy making is important. Okay, party leadership. So a Prime Minister is not just leader of the country, they're also leader of their party. So Tony Blair was not just leader of the UK, he was also leader of the Labour Party. Boris Johnson at the moment is Prime Minister of Britain, obviously, of the UK, but he's also, of course, leader of the Conservatives. And so they also have those kind of roles as well in terms of party leadership. And then public standing. So this is basically how popular a Prime Minister is. If a Prime Minister is really popular, they can usually get more done than if they're unpopular. And the reason is, it's quite simple. If a Prime Minister is really popular, people like them, they're doing well in the opinion polls, etc., 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 then backbench MPs will think, "Ooh, okay, my Prime Minister, the leader of my party, is really popular. I don't really like some of the things he's doing. However, the people in my constituency seem to quite like him. Therefore, I'll be stupid to oppose him, because the people of my constituency will say, hey, why are you opposing this wonderful, brilliant Prime Minister of your party?" So a Prime Minister who's popular often had an easier time dealing with backbench MPs, getting things through Parliament, because they're less likely to oppose him because he's popular and they want to get re-elected. If a Prime Minister is really unpopular, perhaps they've been in power a long time, perhaps they've made mistakes, perhaps they're associated with some unpopular policy. Think of Tony Blair in his latter years, for example. Then backbench MPs will be less likely to support him from his own party. So a lot of Labour MPs in Tony Blair's latter days, they didn't like some of the things he was doing, and because he was also unpopular, they thought, well, actually, if I support the Prime Minister on things which I don't really like what he's doing, the people in my constituency are going to vote me out. I've got a better chance of being re-elected if I oppose him and say, I think Tony Blair's a complete on that particular issue. I'm going to vote against him in the House of Commons. And he can tell his constituency or her constituency, look, I'm not just some Blair puppet, backbench MP. I have got my own brain. I disagree with him on these things. In the hope that his constituents will reward him and say, yeah, actually, we don't like Tony Blair's stuff, but we like our local Labour MP. So public standing is really important. And again, I don't want to go about Tony Blair too much, but the Blair period does show that. So when Tony Blair first became Prime Minister, that massive majority, the major government was really unpopular. Tony Blair could virtually walk on water. And there were some political cartoons done of him walking on water. And all those Labour MPs, and some of the more left-wing ones like Jeremy Corbyn, initially supported him. As time went on, he became more and more unpopular. Then you saw more rebellions take place amongst Labour backbench MPs. Okay, and that's true for most Prime Ministers. I can't think of any Prime Minister who kind of started unpopular and became popular. They usually start off quite popular and then kind of gets worse and worse and worse. Theresa May, look at her, for example. All those backbench MPs, they basically destroyed her time as Prime Minister, because she was unpopular and they felt they could rebel against her, and they did. There's also a bit of an issue of principle, wasn't there, over Europe as well. So, which of these resources makes a PM most powerful? Again, that's up to you to think which one and why. There's no kind of right answer. Okay, so that does the Prime Minister. So, the Cabinet. So, we kind of mentioned the Cabinet a few times. All the Cabinet is, it's those top ministerial jobs, which I think we've, at the very first lessons on the executive, you did those diagrams, didn't you? Okay, so you've got the Prime Minister. It does differ how many is in the Cabinet, because one of the powers of the Prime Minister is he can create or amalgamate or whatever government departments, but there's normally about 20 to 22 people in the Cabinet, and each Cabinet member is a Secretary of State, and they look after an entire department. So Matt Hancock is in the news class at the moment. He's the Secretary of State for Health, and he sits in the Cabinet. Okay, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, she's a Cabinet member. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, he's a Cabinet member. So there's about 20 odd of them. Okay. Again, the Prime Minister appoints Cabinet members. If he wants to have fewer and amalgamate departments, he can do. Now, in theory, in Britain, we have what's called the Cabinet system. And in theory, the Prime Minister is supposed to be first amongst equals. In other words, he's supposed to have equal power to the other Cabinet members. And in fact, as we've looked at briefly before, in some ways he's actually less powerful than the Cabinet because he doesn't have his own department, unlike those Cabinet members. But in theory, the Cabinet are supposed to be the decision makers in the UK government system. So they're supposed to meet up on a regular basis. They normally meet up at least once a week. And they're normally supposed to decide collectively what they're going to do. Okay, so the Prime Minister chairs the meeting. He says, I'm unsure, or I think we need to make some decisions on this, and this. What do we all think? Blah, blah, blah. Hands up. Okay, then we agree to that. So in theory, they're supposed to decide all the major issues within Cabinet. Now, in practice, as we'll find out later in the week and next week, many Prime Ministers, in fact I would say most Prime Ministers, especially in more recent times, tend to make decisions themselves, and they just use the Cabinet as being like a rubber stamp. Okay, so the Prime Minister will, Mrs Thatcher was accused often of actually telling the meeting before they started what she'd already decided, and he just had to agree to her. Okay, other Prime Ministers are a little bit more subtle than that, but very often The Prime Minister will decide most of the things, or they might do it with the cabinet member responsible for that issue. So if there's a transport issue which needs a decision being made, the Prime Minister will have a chat to the Secretary of State for Transport. They'll agree what they're going to do between themselves, and then at Cabinet, the Prime Minister will just say, I think we need to do this regarding this, what do we all think? And they'll say, oh yeah, it's a very good idea, Prime Minister. Now, within the Cabinet, there are some important positions, okay? And again, the textbook goes through this. You also see sub-cabinet committees. So obviously you've got 22 cabinet members. Some of them are more important than others, but they also form their own little subgroups. So you have committees that deals with certain issues. So, for example, there's a National Security Committee. Now, you don't need the Education Secretary of State going to the national security issue committee meeting. You probably don't need. You might do actually with the current crisis, but usually wouldn't have like the Health Secretary going to that type of one either. You'll probably have things like the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary in charge of police, defence possibly would go to that type of meeting. So you often have these smaller committees are formed to deal with particular issues like national security or economic affairs, that type of stuff. Again, there's some questions in your booklet where you have to use the textbook because there's some detail on that. Okay. And again, the Prime Ministers can decide how many of these they want. Do they set up temporary ones? The most famous one, which people have probably heard of, is one called COBRA. COBRA. It sounds like some snake, but it's actually really boring. Actually, it just means Committee Room A. And it basically decides issues in national emergencies. So if there's some crisis or national emergency taking place, the Prime Minister will convene a meeting of COBRA. And those cabinet members who are associated with that crisis, he may invite other members who are not in the cabinet, like the top police people perhaps, or the fire people or whatever, into a COBRA meeting to decide, look, we've got this crisis, what we're going to do. So at the moment with this COVID-19 crisis, there's been lots of these COBRA meetings, and obviously they've involved the Health Secretary, haven't they? The Chancellor, is costing lots of money. The Home Secretary's been involved, local government minister's been involved. We've also had like the top medical people as well, and those top scientists have been involved in it as well, haven't they? As well as the Prime Minister himself, obviously, to decide the strategy about what they're going to do and how they're going to deal with it and blah, 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 blah. Okay? When the London riots took place back in 2011, whatever year it was, okay, David Cameron convened a COBRA meeting, and it had the head of the police in London, it had various other people in there to decide what they were going to do. So, COBRA, it sounds quite exciting. It just means Committee Room A, which is a bit more boring, but again, it's really important for deciding crises. Okay, in your booklet, there's then a page called What is the main role and functions of the Cabinet? And you've got registering decisions, reports and discussions, settling disputes, discussing, deciding major issues. Again, use the textbook to complete that. I'm just seeing what page it's on. 132 to 134. On the top of the sheet, by the way, for the Cabinet, it says, what is the Cabinet? It says, use the McNaughton textbook. I lied. It's the Lynch textbook, okay, which is on Teams. And it actually starts at the very bottom of page 129, not page 130. But apart from the page numbers being slightly wrong, and apart from the name of the author being partly wrong, that's perfectly correct. Okay, so that all needs doing. So that should be quite a nice, fun, easy task for you to do. Now, the Cabinet and the Prime Minister, they're sometimes known as the core executive. What that means is it's the very centre of decision making. So the junior ministers and all those hangers-on, they're seen as being outside the core executive. It's the cabinet members and the Prime Minister are seen as the main decision makers. And as I said previously, in reality, very often it's the Prime Minister who makes most of the decisions, kind of on his little own. So in this little relationship, you've got the cabinet, you've got the Prime Minister, but there's a third group in the core executive, and that is the very top civil servants. Okay. Now we've mentioned before about civil servants. These are unelected people who basically do what the government kind of tells them to do. They write things in legalistic speak, if you want to think about them that way. But they also can give advice to ministers as well. They can't make the decisions for them, but they can say, "Ooh, minister, that's a very brave decision to do that." When someone tried this 10 years ago, it went horribly wrong, or whatever. And one of the key parts of the civil service at the very top is something called the Cabinet Office. Now, in some ways, it sounds quite mundane because it basically types out the agenda for cabinet meetings and kind of informs the cabinet of there's going to be a meeting next Thursday and make sure they've all got the paperwork. But in reality, it's got a lot more power than that. Um, there was an article in Politics Review about 4 or 5 years ago on the Cabinet Office. You will notice that is on Teams. It's in the resources section, and it's under the subheading Role of Ministers, Civil Servants and the Core Executive. So using the article, it also says use the Macnaghten book, but there's not much in there. So using the article, you should be able to complete those questions. And if you are interested, again, this is additional. On the Secret World of Whitehall, episode 1 is called The Real Sir Humphrey. Sir Humphrey was a fictional character. There was a comedy series called Yes Minister and then Yes Prime Minister in the early 1980s. And they used the diaries of Anthony Crosland from the Labour government, where he talks about the relationship between the civil service and the ministers. And the top civil service in this comedy was called Sir Humphrey, and he saw his job basically in trying to stop the minister from doing what he wanted to do by quite clever means. It's a really good series to watch, actually. I'm sure they're probably on YouTube or something, and a little bit dated now, but it is quite good to watch. Anyway, The Secret World of Whitehall, the Real Sir Humphrey, that episode is all about the Cabinet Office, what it does, and then it goes back in time. It was created by Lloyd George to give help to the Prime Minister in the First World War. And it talks about some of the top jobs. To be the Chief Civil Service in this, by the way, you get more than the Prime Minister gets in terms of earnings. So there's a future career for you all. So what I'd like to do is to complete the Cabinet Office, the functions and roles of the Cabinet, and those questions about what is the Cabinet. There's a little bit of extra watching if you want to on the Secret World of the Real Sir Humphrey and the Secret World of Whitehall. There's also a little article on that little section about what they did under the coalition. They formed something called the Quad. Okay, so you might want to have a look at that to see how did cabinet work when you had a coalition. We had two different parties. Okay, so if you do that for Thursday, don't forget the essay which you're doing later on today. And on Thursday, we'll then, I call it the Sex and Lies lesson. We'll do about why ministers get elected, what factors Prime Minister considered when appointing cabinet members, and then we'll look at sex, basically, why do ministers resign. Okay, so I shall leave you with that exciting cliffhanger for later in the week.